Hi there. So I am back in very grounded, humbled space because of what's happening, I think, politically. Um, there's a lot of stress and anxiety that I'm hearing from my husband and my family, and I'm just feeling the polarity of that with the just exquisite nature of what I'm discovering and being led to. So I was torn whether to wait until I was in a really high energy place again, in an expansion state, before recording a video, but I feel that the groundedness of it and the humility that I'm coming to the table with is maybe of use and um, of help to people that are struggling with the polarity. So there's so much that's happened, and I have to share with you, but I also don't want to keep this to be too long. And I'm going to share, so the last visit was when I was in Wales, and I was at the Compassionate Mental Health Conference where I met fascinating, beautiful human beings that have bipolar schizophrenia, hear voices, along with people that are working in that space to try to help. Had an incredible transformative healing experience when I was there, that I shared in the last video. And on my way back, on the plane ride actually, from Dublin to San Francisco, as coincidences go, the woman that was sitting next to me, I ended up striking a conversation with because I felt something really magnetic. I couldn't explain it. Like there was, like it was almost like higher self saying, like, you need to strike up a conversation with this person, because there's something for me to find. So I followed that, and I introduced myself and asked what she was doing. And what was fascinating was she just decided 2 weeks earlier to leave. She'd been living in London for like several years and decided to leave, and had been studying contact improv. I hadn't heard of that before. But what was fascinating was it's basically it's a combination of dance, gymnastics, martial arts, and it's essentially getting into the flow state, so that you move, your body moves, in that flow state, almost like dance, like, or Tai Chi, martial arts, but you do it with two people. So she described how it's about learning to tune into your own energy and getting into that place where you can be present enough to feel the movement and the energy that wants to move through your body, but then doing it with another person where you always stay in contact, and both of you, so it requires you feeling the other person's energy, and you move kind of in conjunction, in parallel. And she said often they're done in these jam sessions where there's 40 people in the room, 3 hours, and you start to move, and often keep your eyes closed because it's not about the performance, it's more about feeling the energy and moving, and she described how at the end of it, the energy in the room was just so visceral, and so people felt so connected. And then when I shared with her, the synchronicities were incredible, because it was like what I'd started to experience in the deep theta state, right? Like in the ayahuasca journey, in the Vipassana experience. Now, every time I go into meditation, all the things I've discovered of getting into that theta state where my body starts to move, to release sankharas, and to like heal, was what she was describing. But now to do it I hadn't heard of, like, to do it with another person, and to get into this collective state of group coherence or group flow could be incredibly healing and incredibly powerful. So I was just in awe of the synchronicity of it. And it didn't stop there. So of course, we ended up chatting for long, and she ended up moving not too far from where I am. So I'm sure that story will continue in terms of the exploration and how this could help heal people. And she had connections with people that have had severe mental health as well. So just the exploration that we were both looking at in terms of how this might be of help to people was incredibly fascinating and fun, really inspiring. And since then, let's see, there's been a number of things that have happened. So let's see, where should I start? Okay, so someone had, and now this is the third time I'm hearing about Jonathan Haid's work. So Jonathan Haid is a social scientist, researcher, professor. I think he's at NYU Stern now, but he essentially has published The Anxious Generation, which I've heard about from a number of folks. It's a New York Times bestseller, and The Righteous Mind. And my husband, Rohit, had mentioned these books and some of the content from it. So he'd mentioned, what I heard from my husband, which I then was led to, and it fit so perfectly into what was happening. So what I started noticing was, and as I mentioned in a previous video, I think that the practice that I started following was like when I feel any strong emotion, then it's like tuning into the body, feeling where it is, and then starting to like explore going into what's the underlying belief that's causing me to have that trauma, that sees it with judgment or criticism or shame or guilt, and then trying to reframe the belief so that I can then move through healing, essentially, by seeing it as a deep intelligence of the system as opposed to something that should be judged. And so there were a number of things that happened. One was, so Jonathan Haidt, I have to share this with you because it was just too entertaining and too interesting. Let me see if I can find it. So in his research for the Righteous Mind, which is all about the political divide and how people are so divided, and on these issues of morality and so on. He did a lot of research around morality in particular, and what he found was, here it is. This thing he called moral dumbfounding. Okay, and he mentioned it in the book, and he's done a ton of research around this. Okay, so essentially, here's a number of scenarios, and you can see what you think, like what comes to mind when you hear them. Okay, a woman's cleaning out her closet. She finds an old American flag. She doesn't want the flag anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her bathroom. Second scenario, a family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They'd heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. It gets worse. Or better, depending on how you look at it. The third one, a brother and sister like to kiss on the mouth. When nobody's around, they find a secret hiding place and kiss each other. And then I heard another version of that in some other, I think it's the version my husband was sharing from the book, that they go on to have sex, protected sex. And then the fourth scenario was, my husband's version of this was more graphic, so I'll keep it to this version. A man goes to the supermarket once a week, buys a dead chicken, but before cooking the chicken, he has sex with it. Then he thoroughly cooks it and eats it. So, do these things seem wrong to you? And why? Most people would say yes. But when Jonathan would ask his professor what exactly is wrong with each of them, people would restate kind of the problem, like, okay, like incest is going to cause kids that, are deformed, or he says, yeah, but they use protection. They weren't planning on having kids, or it's unpatriotic to like burn the flag or to cut up the flag, or essentially. So when he double clicked on it and said, well, what moral principle is being violated exactly? People couldn't come up with that. What he basically described it as, it's like it's hard to locate a moral or ethical principle being violated in each of these scenarios, but people feel like it's wrong. So what he found was in his research that it's called moral dumbfounding, and it's like people generate theological arguments that appear rational and well justified, but it's really just a way to justify how they feel. So, and what he showed also in there was different cultures have different conditions, like it's conditioned into us, morality, and it can vary from culture to culture. So, for example, in some Asian cultures, they had an example of like a woman cooks dinner, her husband has some friends, male friends over, she cooks dinner, sits down to eat with them. Is that okay or not? And in some Asian cultures, that's considered taboo. You're not supposed to do that. It's unacceptable. There's moral judgment around that. Whereas in the United States, for example, there'd be no issue with that. So he shows all these different examples how morality is not it's not an absolute. It's something that's conditioned through culture, and it can vary from culture to culture. Well, the reason I found it so interesting is in the process of like what I was moving through with a couple of friends around processing trauma and healing, one of the fundamental components was seeing the deep intelligence of the response. And often we judge and like shame ourselves because we're conditioned to have a moral judgment about whatever it is that we did. And so essentially then it's like when you start to look at it in this lens of the system is trying to balance, is trying to like heal, and it's gonna like, so for example, if you're in a powerless situation, you might do something to feel powerful. And it might come across, you might have judgment about what it is that you did. But the system doesn't have judgment. Consciousness doesn't have judgment. Darkness is as much a part of consciousness as the light. So the system is always trying to balance, and it's all about experience. We're on these epic journeys, multiple lives, where we're trying to learn different things. So sometimes the pendulum swings one way, and so then it has to swing the other way, so that we can experience all that there is to experience. And so when you start looking at it from that lens, it's like, what is the deep intelligence in the system? Then you can start to reframe your beliefs and the judgment and the criticism, the guilt, the shame that we feel about the things that we did or things that happened to us or through us. And it starts to allow, like it loosens the grip. It allows you to start looking at it with equanimity, like just to observe it from a calm place. And that's what allows you to release the sankhara to heal the trauma. So reframing the beliefs is a fundamental, an absolutely key component. So I was so thrilled that out of coincidence, several people had now pointed me to Jonathan Haid's research, including my husband, and how perfectly it was fitting in to like what I was learning on the path. Okay, so it goes on from there. A friend of mine had recommended this podcast on the Huberman, from the Huberman lab, Dr. Huberman, with, what's his first name? It's Schwartz, Dr. Schwartz. Dick Schwartz, Richard Schwartz, who created Internal Family Systems, IFS. IFS is basically, I had heard about it and it resonated like very much with me. Even in the first podcast that I did several years back, which was, it's every time you have something that registers as trauma, and it gets frozen in time, that part of you. So if you're 6 or 10 or 15 or whatever it is, and then it gets stored in your subconscious as an unprocessed memory. And anytime it gets triggered, that part of you emerges. So it's almost like having a round table. I used to drive a round table of characters from all your major traumas, when you were 6 or 10 or 15 or 50, whatever. And if it gets triggered by any of the 5 senses, and we can't control when that occurs, that part of us emerges, and now we're reliving that experience and having the same thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations that we did when we registered as trauma. So we might be acting like a 6-year-old if it registers, if that part of me, and I'm going back to this quantum superposition, I'm taken to that dimension, right? That's where my awareness goes. That's my reality, and if it gets deep enough of a trauma, you can end up in a psychotic state, which is what happens when you can have schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, or, even bipolar extremes and so on. So what he talked about in this podcast, it was so fascinating. And it was a big shift for my husband and I in terms of being able to work through things that were, that he in particular was like stressed with, he was able to start to look at, and allowed me to develop a much deeper understanding of how he was seeing those and why those were so triggering for him. And so we ended up seeing a pretty fundamental shift through it, but it was essentially, and I'm going to post the podcast itself and the link where he starts to go through an exercise to ask you to walk through it yourself. So a lot of it's about, and this was the first time I'd heard all of the details around it, around what it is exactly and how it works. Essentially, we have these, so we have, when we're children, we have all these, attributes or characteristics like love and openness and playfulness and so on. And then things might happen to us or that we inherit that like shuts those down, and so then we become, those parts of us become hurt for whatever number of reasons that it happens. And then we exile those parts. So we tuck them away because, now they feel guilt or shame, or they're hurt in some way. They no longer feel open, or they no longer feel love. So they get exiled by us and by, because their emotions are too strong that they feel the guilt or the shame or the sadness or the fear. So we exile them. And we tuck them away deep into the subconscious. And then what starts happening is, because we don't want to feel those feelings again, that's right, the system trying to maintain a balance. So essentially then, there are other parts that form, and they call them firefighters and protectors. They're managers, essentially. The firefighters are ones that, anytime that those parts of us get triggered in the world, sometimes we'll trigger it, so then that part of that part of us emerges from some trauma. The protectors don't want us to feel the raw emotion, so they jump in, other parts of us, jump in and do things that are either create even more extreme conditions, or to try to distract us. So it might be alcohol or drugs or sex or work, something that takes us away, often addictions or behaviors. And then essentially then we may do things that we then feel guilt and shame about. So other parts that come in and now criticize us and judge us, including society, because of conditioning. So now we have these protectors that are preventing us from feeling, the pain of the exiles or the judgment for the, the firefighters. So then these critics, these protectors are critics or managers. They're trying to manage the situation to prevent you from. So they're the ones that make you people pleasers and critics, and they make you do things to minimize the chance that you'll touch the exile, right? So if I work really hard, I don't feel guilt and shame, or I don't feel worthless, which is what the exile might feel. So I try to manage the situations, right? These are the managers, the protectors. And essentially then they might yell at the firefighters for like creating all this havoc and doing all these impulsive, the firefighters tend to be really impulsive, come in and just like try to put out the fire or like do something else that would distract. And so you end up with these layers of parts. And what in IFS, what he talked about was he actually did a demo with Huberman And then he asked the audience to do it, and I highly recommend it. It was fascinating when I did it. So what he essentially does, the basic process is essentially, he asks the person to feel into the body. Like, if, let's say there's something that they are struggling with, they have a strong emotion around it. Maybe a problem they have, or some pattern that they've noticed, or some challenging, experience, and so on. And then he asks them to like see if they can feel into the body where it is. And this goes back to the somatic practice that Hubel teaches, that like I learned in Vipassana, that I've like been learning on this journey. That's so powerful. And so then the person would, in my case, it was like in the gut, in the second chakra, in the belly. And then he would say like, what does this part want you to know about it? Like, is there any message for you? And it's like, and he asked like, how do you feel about, what's your feeling towards that part? It's like, well, I get frustrated because they're really driving me, or I get really tired, or they're always like criticizing me, or they're always making me people please, or they're having me work like a dog, whatever it is, you might feel it. So maybe you feel some frustration or maybe some exhaustion or whatever. So he kind of acknowledges that. And then he asks what message they're trying to send, and why it is that they need to do that. What's the reason they're having you do that thing, or, criticizing you or making people please. And so then the message will come through. And so, for example, it might be, in my case, it was like, well, I have to do that because otherwise, there'll be bad behavior. We'll see like the bad behavior of like the addiction, for example. Like, I'm a workaholic, and other characteristics that have emerged. And it's like, so to prevent, from actually, no, that would be the protector. It would be like the next layer of it. So in my case, I think it was a trauma where it was like shame and guilt and fear in the second chakra. In this case, it was like ancestral trauma, sexual trauma. And so essentially then it's like he goes to the next layer. It might be a firefighter that makes you like do the addiction. In this case, maybe it's a workaholic, or it's, drugs or sex or whatever. And then it would be like, what's beneath it? What's beneath that behavior? And so if you get to the next, like maybe in my case, let's say doing something impulsive. So like shopping, sometimes when I get really into a fight with my husband and I'm like really enraged, I'll do something that's really rebellious, and I'll go shopping, and then I'll, feel guilt or shame and so on. That's the exile that's feeling that. So essentially then it's like, what he asks then is he'll ask this protector, this manager, to say, would you be willing to give us permission to like go to the part of you that has, let's say, the addiction, so that we can see if we can like fix or heal? And then, you wait to hear for a response, and it's like, yeah, but it's not going to work. It's like, well, would you be willing to give us a little room to try? Usually they'll say yes. So then he'll go to the firefighter. In this case, let's say it's my workaholic tendencies. And maybe like the critic is like criticizing me because I'm not accomplished enough and I'm not successful enough, and the, kicks in the workaholic behavior. Or let's say that's the workaholic behaviors, and underneath it is like this addiction. So then he'll say, go to the next part and say, same kind of process, and what is it you're trying to protect, and are there other parts you're protecting? And it comes to the vulnerable part, the exiled part. So essentially then it's like, that's when I went there and he asked the question, and what's the message? I immediately burst into tears, and I could feel the guilt and shame. And the message that I got was like, that joy and pleasure are sins, that you need to work hard and procreate. That's the only reason to have joy and pleasure. And, that kind of thing. And I realized when I went there that like, wow, the amount of guilt and shame that I felt was so strong. I could see the desire to just quickly escape from it, to do an activity that was impulsive or reactive, to get out of it. And then to try to compensate with like workaholic tendencies to re-earn my sense of self or my sense of accomplishment, because I was feeling judged and humiliated or shameful. But it was really powerful. And then my husband was listening to this, and while it didn't fully resonate for him, what he did like cognitive behavioral therapy, he kind of started going through the scenarios of catastrophizing. He was catastrophizing, the market crashing. I quit my job. The kids are like trying to find internships and get into college, and like all the stresses around that, all the fears around that had emerged for him. So he was kind of spiraling in this space, and it allowed him to go and look at each one to see, like in his case, he was looking at what's the worst case scenario, and he kind of walked himself back off the ledge just going through this process. So it was really, really powerful. And Richard Schwartz talked also about psychedelics, and actually like ketamine and psilocybin, the two of them, Huberman as well, talked about how powerful psychedelics are. And what Dr. Schwartz mentioned is that it actually quiets the protector, so you can get to the exiles more easily. So what would normally take maybe 10 sessions of IFS, you could do 15 minutes of ketamine, for example, which is legal. Ketamine therapy, and even more powerfully with other things like psilocybin or ayahuasca or these other psychedelics, because it quiets the protectors. So then you can get right to the exiles and heal. And the way that I've seen some of the videos that he was healing was really allowing the exile to feel, to bring it to the surface, into the light, to feel this guilt and the shame or whatever it is, to be able to have a safe enough space and to have permission from the protectors and firefighters to actually experience it and to bring it to the surface. And then what, often it's like you'd ask the age, what age do you think I am? And often it's like small, it's like 5 or even smaller baby that they think you are. So you can update that part of you and the age that you actually are. And sometimes they'll start to mature. And the other thing he would do is like, can we take you to a safer place, either out into the world or another part of the body or a fantasy world, this part of me, so that you come out of that place where you're trapped and imprisoned, exiled, and you come into a new place, and then processing these emotions and starting to move through what he's found has been really powerful for healing. And then he brings the firefighter back in to see the shift, and then he brings the protector back in to see the shift, so they don't feel like they need to do as much protection. And that's how he starts going through the layers of healing. Anyway, so I was trying this when I got back. Ended up seeing massive shifts and release of like guilt and shame and some of my addictive tendencies, and really starting to realize how much judgment and shame was conditioned from the culture and from the past that was no longer relevant. So it's been phenomenal, amazing. And to do this with friends has been really nurturing, nourishing for both the connection and for self, to have a safe enough space to do that. So highly recommend it. And if you need someone to do it, reach out to me to do it with you. Okay, so the story continues. I was speaking with one of the folks I met in Wales, and a woman that had been hospitalized like many times in her life, adult life, because she'd move into these manic states and then, would wake up in the hospital heavily medicated. And one of the things that I shared in a previous video when I visited, last video, was that the way she sees the world, the experiences she'd had, like meeting beings from other dimensions, connecting with guides and spirits and so on. I'd had similar experiences, and I had similar views. That she was going through contraction, expansion. She had similar views. And one of the things she said was, I think the difference between us is that your system has the capacity to handle these expansive states or these depressed states. Mine, I'm not able to handle it. So I end up, in these places where, I'm doing things that end up getting me hospitalized and so on. And I was really thinking about that. And then what I read about in the Consciousness Sutras, which someone had shared with me, and I don't know if I've shared them with you yet, but fascinating. I'll include the link. But essentially, the part that was blowing me out of the water when I read it, because it resonated for me. So when I was speaking with this one person, one of the things she talked about was what it was like in the expansive state. So she talked about like feeling very connected to the universe, like to these higher powers or energy, to consciousness. She was getting all these ahas and insights, connecting dots, and getting all this clarity. So she was literally describing exactly what I felt when my husband, for example, he was like, you seem a little manic, because it was all this energy moving through me. And what the Consciousness Sutras talked about was these kundalini spikes. So the kundalini is like, it's considered like spiritual energy that's stored at the base of the spine and the sacrum. They call it, like for the Shiva Shakti story, it's Shakti. It's the feminine energy. Then as you have spiritual awakening, it rises up through the chakras, and you gain more and more powers as it rises. And it can go all the way to the 7th chakra, the crown, the top of the head, where there's Shiva. So you get the Shiva Shakti unification, and you get Kundalini, spiritual awakening. Anyway, you can get these Kundalini spikes, which can be like a rush of energy in the system. What they were saying in the Consciousness Sutras is the system may not be mature enough to handle it. So, a friend of mine had this happening at a Vipassana retreat, Kundalini awakening, and she thought she was having a seizure because it was so strong. It freaked her out, right? It was really like overwhelming to the system. And I think what even happens, and I think it's even like with genius, people who have who are genius and then they go crazy. So someone I'd met there had electric shock therapy then, and then ended up damaging the brain. But essentially then, what they also mentioned in the Consciousness Sutras, when this is the amazing aha that I realized, was they said that the fascia, work on the fascia increases the capacity of the system to handle the Kundalini spikes. And I have been drawn to fascia work. There's a video I created, I don't know, a few weeks back, I think, around the different tools that I discovered with the fascia, how trauma is stored in the fascia. And they're describing that exact thing in these Consciousness Sutras. So as a three-dimensional liquid crystalline matrix that encompasses everything, the bones, the muscles, all the way down to the cells. It's like the glue in the system. And trauma, psychological, physiological, or emotional, is stored. It goes from liquid, crystalline, to solid. And it can exert forces up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. So it starts to create structural, shifts in the body. So, and the way I describe it is, imagine wearing a Spider-Man suit, a perfectly fitted suit. And if you were to get into an accident, injure your right hip, and imagine a knot on your right hip, you might see, if you're wearing a fitted suit, knots that go down to my right foot and across my left shoulder, right? There are wrinkles that are going across here because it's fitted. So then after a while, I'm like, why does my left shoulder hurt? I may not associate it with my right hip injury, but because of the fascia, everything's connected. It's one seamless, or one structure, three-dimensional liquid crystalline structure in the body. And what they talked about as well, and I ended up reaching out to the consciousness researcher that wrote the Consciousness Sutras. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Ovidiu. I didn't write it down, but he lives in Romania, a professor that's out there doing this research for years. I reached out to him, and what was fascinating that he talked about, and he talked about this even in this Consciousness Sutras. So I gotta read you this. The coincidence of this was just absolutely phenomenal. Here it is. Okay, so he talked about the spiritual awakenings, and he talked about in the 75th Sutra, some evolutionary processes unfold in dramatic ways, which may be quite distressing for the people around them. The societal reaction is to confuse these transformational moments and consider them as a kind of psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, which slows down the transformation process if one is required to use long-term medications. What are the chances? So I'm being drawn. I just came out of this compassionate mental health, right? Bipolar, schizophrenia, voices, people hearing voices. I realize I have some of the characteristics of bipolar historically and addiction. I'm able to relate to these experiences. I've been drawn to fascial work, and now I run into these Consciousness Sutras, which describe the fact that maybe the only reason I haven't ended up having a bipolar diagnosis or hearing voices like a schizophrenic is because my higher self took me to all these fascial techniques and tools like MFR, acupuncture, yoga balls. Contact improv is another one. And he actually even mentions in his email back to me, it's so amazing, completely unprompted. I just simply asked, what research could he point me to that shows how to increase the capacity of the system through fascia work for these Kundalini spikes? And what he shared was, said, that you want to tap into the intelligence of the system. And that he talked about how fascia, more than just increasing the capacity, and I was looking at some of the research then, but it's basically how it's a communication network, kind of like the mycelium of trees, where they can communicate to each other, a huge network. That's what the fascia is in the system. So they have these microtubules, the fascia microtubules, which energy can flow through. And it's connected, it's tensegrity, where it can be in compression and extension within the system. It maintains its balance. So it can communicate. And what I realized was, and what they talked about in some of the documents and research around it, is it's like the quantum field internally. So essentially everything can communicate all at once because of the fascia that connects everything. Similar to the quantum field that they're discovering, that connects everything, why it can move faster than the speed of light. That's why Einstein's theory and Niels Bohr, quantum physicist, no one could reconcile until David Bohm came along, who was a quantum physicist as well, and said, because Einstein said nothing travels faster than the speed of light. Well, Niels Bohr in quantum physics found that in quantum physics, two particles can be even, great distances apart, are communicating instantaneously and moving, and one starts moving in one direction, the other one instantly starts, and if the other one is shifted, the other one immediately, so they're not communicating, it's faster than the speed of light. So they couldn't explain that until David Bohm was able to explain it through this quantum field. And I think that's what's happening internally. The subconscious is the fascia in the body. So when we store, that's why when we have trauma, it's stored in the subconscious, physically, emotionally, psychologically, all in the fascia. In Chinese medicine, the meridians run along the fascia, no coincidence. So now this starts to connect the dots across quantum physics, ancient practices, modern medicine. It's just fascinating. So maybe the reason that I'm able to handle this is because I'm led to these techniques. Maybe this is what we need to bring to more people, is these tools and techniques of how to heal and remove trauma from the fascia. And that might allow all of us, and given the mental health epidemic, so this is something that Jonathan Haidt had shared too, was by I've seen this in a couple of places, by 2030, in the next 5 years, mental illness is expected to be the largest health burden in the world. And you can see it with what's happening politically and globally, astrologically. It's just huge amounts of churn and change. So I don't know if you're following along, like the astrologers, Pam Gregory is amazing. I just listened to one of hers this morning. But it's, outer planets, 7 of the outer planets have shifted. And typically that's associated with major planetary changes. They're quite rare. I think she said it was like 300 BC was like the last time it occurred. And so we're starting to already see pretty major shifts happening, in the United States and across the world, that's threatening, people's sense of safety and security and mental health. And we're starting to see an acceleration. And I think what's happening, and I've heard a number of folks say this is my feeling as well, over the next few years, 2 in particular, we're getting taken into more and more chaos and darkness collectively. But what that's going to do is, as people fall into more darkness, that's when their hearts crack open. That's what happened to me. I fell into the darkness when I was, in that case, at Google, because I was no longer getting the extrinsic validation. I fell to rock bottom. That's when my heart cracked open, and I was able to find my humanity and connect with others. That's what I think is happening collectively. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. For those of you that are really feeling afraid of everything that's happening on the planet right now, hang in there, man. Reach out if you need to, but hang in there. Like, join groups that are like seeing where this is going. As people fall into darkness, they start to seek the light. And then those of us that are starting to be pulled into the light, to build structures and systems and forums and tools to help people move through it, then there's paths for people to move to, or, fall into, or to seek out. So was that everything I wanted to share? I did want to, oh no, there was one more thing. So I've been also then led to people that I've started to work with that have addictions and that have bipolar and are hearing voices. And I can resonate with all of it. And that's what I'm moving through, and I'm healing reflections of self. So every person that's coming on my path, including and especially with bipolar, schizophrenia, like hearing voices, like addictions, are basically reflections of deeper wound within self. So as my sense of self, as I keep healing, my sense of self keeps expanding, and I'm able to feel more and more and more of the collective. And so it's been this really beautiful journey of the second chakra. That's what I've realized. And the last thing I'm going to share with you, oh my gosh, we've gone on for like 30 minutes here, is the second chakra, the information about the second chakra, because I think this is something that's happening across the planet. Okay, so one of the things that I realized in my exploration and my healing, is that one of the messages I had, as I shared with you, was like, I know there's been a lot of sexual trauma in my ancestral history, and so the messages that are stored, I mean, maybe even childhood, I don't remember it, but in my second chakra, which is what my higher self's been focused on, and the second chakra is all about desire, identity, sexual identity. If that gets blocked, then you repress that energy. You essentially then can it has to manifest in some form. And what I realized was, like, I had basically cut off from my sexuality growing up. It's not something I even thought about. It's just something I don't want to say disgust, but it was like judgment and criticism or shame around it, something. I just never engaged in anything, even for self, all the way up through college, when I met my current husband, who then started to help me explore it a little bit. But even then, and for many years, I didn't feel safe or comfortable. I would fake orgasms. I couldn't have one without a vibrator. I really repressed and suppressed my sexuality. And what I only recently discovered was that because of the conditioning and the belief that was stored in the subconscious, that, sexual pleasure and, fun or pleasure is only for procreation, and anything outside of that is sinful. That was what I found as the message. That's what drove me to so many tears when I first discovered it. And the age was like really young. So essentially then that must have gotten programmed in. And when I started to like realize that's not my current beliefs, that's not what my mature self would say. So even starting to reprogram that belief system and let go of the shame and the guilt, and to let that move through me up and out. And it's been intense, really intense. And I've had, luckily, safety of like friends that have, able to walk me through that when I moved there. But it would move to like when I would go there, shame and guilt, like extreme emotions on the body. Like I would feel heat, I would feel like I'd start sweating, get really uncomfortable. I wasn't comfortable talking about it because I felt all the shame. But because of the encouragement and the support, I was able to like vocalize more of it and actually speak to it. Like, and what I realized was, like I mentioned in a previous video, it was like bringing it into the light from the darkness, which was actually kind of comfortable because it was familiar and hidden away and could maintain that judgment and that conditioning. Once I brought it to the light and actually talked about it, then I could see, and it was like a relief. It was like a release of this burden that I'd been carrying, that this exile had been carrying. And then I was able, but what I noticed was it would be, and I was doing multiple rounds of this, and I've now done since then because it's so powerful, and I've been open to it. But what I would notice is like I would feel like, let's say, close to someone or connection, and then I would start feeling that like, either, shame or guilt start to come up, or fear or emptiness would start to come in, and then when I would just honor it, then sometimes I'd feel dread and panic, like existential fear would come up. Just continue honoring it, and I would then like be able to, like through tears or through like just honoring what was arising, able to like start to let it go. And then I would move to this place of like high vibration and like joy and peace and pleasure and playfulness, like an innocence that was like probably what the ex I had when I was a young child. All right, so I'm going to share with you what was like so powerful about the second chakra, because I think a lot of people across the planet, and I think if you look at it, like the world in this epoch has suppressed the feminine. That's the second chakra: sexuality, creation, womb, right, motherhood, etc. Second chakra, it's like our reproductive function, but essentially it's like everyone has masculine and feminine in every being. The feminine is suppressed in this epoch, and that's why so many cultures mistreat women and Mother Earth, because of this reason. So the journey to unity consciousness for the planet and for humanity is embracing the feminine. So the Shiva Shakti story, like the women, I think it's going to be a story of like feminine rising, right? The women embrace the feminine, discover their, from toxic femininity and masculinity to unity consciousness. That inspires and gives permission, or encourages the men to embrace their feminine and to then achieve unity consciousness. And then you're going to start getting the twin flames, like the fractal, across humanity, where we're going to start to experience this golden age, which is supposed to start happening in 2027. So I'm going to share from Gift of the Body, amazing book by Jonathan Goldman, who's head of the Santa Daime Church, who I've had a number of just incredible experiences with, ayahuasca experiences with. Wrote this book, Gift of the Body, and he talks, I picked a couple of snippets, a bunch of them, from the second chakra that I'm going to share with you, because I think it's so relevant to what's happening on the planet. All right, so the second chakra is between the navel and the pubic bone, and it's the statement of health is I'm alive. The life lesson is desire. So desire originates in the second chakra. The second chakra wants what it wants when it wants it. Desire unleashed is the ultimate ignore of consequences. That can be terrific depending on the circumstances, because desire unleashed can lead to unmitigated pleasure and enormous creativity and aliveness. And it can lead to difficult and even tragic consequences when the intense moment of desire gives way to what desire has wrought. Dancing and loving the night away is a great gift to give oneself. The morning after may not be so much. The lower chakra's assessment of what is good for us is based on our need to survive at all costs. That impulse of self-preservation is built into the lower self, which is represented by the first three chakras. Do it to them before they do it to me is a guiding principle of much that human beings undertake in the name of security and survival. It's not surprising that many of those advocating such a stance in the world also demonstrate the characteristics of a severely repressed second chakra. The second chakra is basically a perpetual 2-year-old. We impose rules for our second chakra, usually starting at the age of 2 years, such as good boys don't cry, good girls don't let boys do that, say please, be quiet, work hard. Those demanding to control other people's second chakra activities, such as controlling sexuality, reproduction, freedom of lifestyle, freedom of speech, are blatantly demonstrating their own second chakra distortions and projecting them outward. Some of this discipline is necessary and good. It's in the, quote, highest good of all beings to have some limits on behavior. The problem is we've gone many steps beyond that usefulness into the realm of collective illness. Much of the distortion from our society's squeezing of our second chakras can be laid at the feet of religions that it felt the need to control people by controlling their sexuality and thus freedom of choice. But the framework of repression goes way beyond reasonable agreements for community harmony. Repression is made up of the thought forms of ideology, fear of rejection, opinions of right, wrong, and good and bad. It's glued with the threat of ostracism, poverty, and legal punishment. I mean, you look at what's happening right now in the United States, and this is second chakra repression like crazy. The sensible plan is to create good citizens. The method is to put a clamp on our second chakra in order to make the suppression permanent. The purpose of this tactic is to impose obedience to norms for the sake of conformity, which is not the same as freedom with limits. We must contend with the hidden consequences of a squelched second chakra for a portion of our lives, at least until the teapot cannot contain the steam anymore, and the squelched desire blows up our health and our lives. The fifth chakra, which is the voice, the throat, the direct partner of the second chakra, is responsible for channeling the energy of desire that it receives from the second chakra. A second chakra without a heart commanding it, and an open fifth chakra expressing and creating it with its energy, is like an animal in the cage. If we don't want to be hurting other people by our random expulsion of the force of desire, we will naturally need to shut the second chakra down. This is what I did. An unguided second chakra can expel too much energy in the pursuit of pleasure without attention to repercussion or respect for the objects of its desire. To test, he talks about testing it by feeling vibration in the middle of the pelvis, where the second chakra is, center of the chest, the heart, and then at the base of the throat, which is the fifth chakra. The fifth chakra is the expression of desire, so the second chakra is desire and your ability to identify it and not be judged for it. So if it's repressed here, then you can't express it either. And so then your voice is suppressed and that chakra gets suppressed, and there's implications of that also. Okay, so let me continue here. Repression and isolation cause holding, which then cause stagnation, eventually leading to illness, etheric, emotional, and mental. The prayer for healing of the second chakra is a prayer for freedom. The process is quite intense, and the chakra will inevitably release the intensity of a deep healing process. And pent-up backlog of energetic darkness, congestion, and emotional material in the light that the prayer calls to us. That's what I was experiencing. To go through the intensity of a deep healing process, we need to seek the help of people who've walked the path before us, who can grab our hand, assuring us that the intense process of transformation will in fact lead to greater freedom and happiness. So this is like friends that I've had that have been able to hold a really safe space for me so that I can actually release this pent-up darkness in my system and start to move to healing, which is really beautiful. So this goes back to peer-to-peer. We need each other to help heal. So find that person. If you don't have it, reach out to people that might be able to offer it to you. But that's a really beautiful way to help move through this process. When the system is functioning optimally, the fifth chakra dutifully and joyfully seeks out the objects of desire and makes a magnetic connection with them, so that the second chakra can be satisfied and supply pleasure and renewal to the entire system. And this is what I started experiencing, was essentially as I started to heal it, I started feeling, instead of like this repressed and confusing like sentiment, it became like this magnetic, really pure, beautiful like energy of connection. And so another desire awakens, one centered in our being rather than in the second chakra, that's not as fiery, but in its subtlety is equally as strong. It's a desire for spiritual connection, and over our lifetime, it grows like background music becoming a song. When we're harmonized inside ourselves, when the team of the second, fourth, and fifth chakras is operating smoothly, freedom is an internal sensation and limits on it are internally imposed as well. We have less need for external references for what we should or shouldn't do. Eventually, however, our lower self-expression of desire will be transmuted to be replaced by a satisfaction so deep and a vibration of light so strong that what was previously desire for things or people or carnal pleasure will become an overwhelming desire for union with the divine. He talks about the different archetypes that come from second chakra, like lover, healer, and killer. So the expression of this chakra union comes out as an expansion of sexuality, romance, excitement, song, and poetry, and also as potential misery, drama, and suffering, all in the name of thwarted desire. That's the lover. The healer is the healing relationship involves great intimacy. The healer takes the energy of desire, moves it into the heart and the third eye, sixth chakra. The second chakra is involved as it offers the force of connection and intimacy with another person, but its energy is not expressed directly. The desire to help someone else is still desire, and there's no healing without this profound connection of one person to the other. The one seeking healing makes themselves vulnerable to another person, whom they've chosen to trust, letting the healer by stages into the depth of their being. So this is the thing. It's like I've been taken down a path of healing, and I felt such deep connection that I was worried about, honestly, sometimes. But then I realized that, like, as I healed, that moved to the heart and the third eye. And that's like, you need that depth of connection, that magnetic connection and safety in order to heal, both as the receiver and as the healer. It's a two-way street. Both people are healing and receiving. And then they talked about the killer. So this is the hunter and the warrior, which are necessary for survival in the animal world and in the human world. It takes the neutral life force that gathers in the second chakra, puts it in service of domination or overpowering the other. That's when it gets distorted. And that's when people can, have the will to take another life. This is projecting the life force strongly through the third and sixth chakras. The heart is cut out of the equation in that case with the killer. So what motivates the killer can be any number of forces that live in the system. Perhaps the person's life has been infiltrated by rage, which arises from a frustrated, damaged second chakra and colors a life force like a polluted river. The desire and plotting for revenge that comes from the distortion of the quality of justice lives in the third chakra and can be a distortion of intimacy. So the more repressed or held in the life force in our second chakra, the less range of choices we have for its expression. This is so because first, the energy that's available for that expression is quantitatively lessened by being repressed. And it's often accomplished by putting restrictions on the fifth chakra's natural ability to express what the second chakra gives it to put out into the world. The more narrow range of expression that we have, the less opportunity we'll have in our life for learning through the choices we make. This is why the worldwide struggle for freedom is not just an emotional or political fight. It's a profoundly spiritual, although not necessarily or even mostly religious. It's literally a battle for our right to have the full extent of our divinely given human experience on earth. Those seeking to restrict freedom are fighting a losing battle on the side of preserving darkness. Ultimately, darkness itself craves light. So in the long run, freedom wins. In the short run, the battle can be hard and fought, and at times discouraging. Spontaneity, which is one of the second chakra's most precious qualities, is subject to the fear of being hurt for stepping outside of imposed bounds of behavior. This is the cultural conditioning I was mentioning. Eventually, the need for spontaneous release of energy through some kind of meaningful expression will have its day. If it's not given healthy outlets, it can express as illness, addiction, depression, and even violence, but it will make itself known. The second chakra is squeezed, and its energy is drawn into the third chakra, where passion is turned into constant work and the plan for, if not the reality of achievement and worldly gain. This is what happened to me. So when my second chakra got repressed, the energy moved to the third chakra. That's the seat of the ego. That's will and aggression, accomplishment, worldly gain, material desire. This is most of my life. Like going to Harvard and MIT and getting to Google and getting to director and like chasing material acquisition and gain and accomplishment until I kept crashing and burning and finally started to heal. Okay, so this unnatural distribution results in coagulation in the physical, etheric, emotional, and mental bodies in both the pelvis and the stomach area. Various types of illnesses can manifest in those regions as well as in the throat and chest, where the expected energy is denied over a long period of time. A major symptom of repressed second chakra is depression. Being depressed is a symptom of a person's second chakra's energy not being free. Children's second chakras need to play and express and make mistakes and explore and be wild. What they don't need is pressure to achieve or the fear of reprisal for being children. Another obvious epidemic malady is sexual distortion of all kinds, from the disconnected fascination with pornography on the parts of millions of people all over the world, to the sad criminality resulting from the absurd misunderstanding of sexuality by many religious organizations, to the exploitation of children and women in many parts of the world. We see the symptoms of life force being twisted by unacknowledged fear, anger, and confusion. So essentially, this is what we're seeing. So much of the mental illness, I think, is second chakra block. And because there's been so much repression in this epoch, and in so many cultures and so many religions, it's having its day, man. It's time. It's time to let it go. Pleasure is not just a matter of individuals' energy bodies vibrating at a rate that we interpret as pleasure. It's also a matter of feeling the vibrations of life around us and in people, and through this openness, feeling a part of the greater whole. Restriction in this body results in the experience of isolation. Felt experience of isolation is at the root of many illnesses. Loneliness is huge right now. It's an epidemic. And Vivek Murthy talked about this in his book. It was Together, I think it was called. I can't remember the exact name of it, but beautiful book. And I'm going to read last thing here. The human life expressions of the second chakra's job of connecting to other life forces involves direct interaction with other people and with the world. But in this body, all of those temporary connections are held in the arms of the longing for spiritual communion, of the inherent need to experience vibrational unity with the forces of nature, a spiritual transpersonal ecstasy that comes from the experience of becoming one with something much greater than ourselves. Something we can know through that experience is also us. This level of communion is something rare, but not at all impossible to experience. It comes through grace, at a point when we've cleared the lower levels of the chakra through conscious work, through opening to the sometimes terrifying experience of intimacy, and through owning and feeling our emotions and embracing our life force in all its expressions. I just wanted to leave you with that. So go deep. Find someone that can hold space for you. And if you don't have someone, reach out to me. And let's see what we can do to help heal each other and planet. Take care. Much love.